Hey guys, thanks for checking out today's video. My name's Jacob. I am a full-time photographer and videographer, and I've had quite a few requests from people asking if I could break down how to start shooting in manual mode on your DSLR or your mirrorless camera. I know this is a big hurdle for a lot of newer photographers, but I promise it's worth it, and you're gonna have so much more control over what you're able to accomplish with your camera once you have a little bit more of an understanding of what all those dials and controls are actually doing to affect your image. So it's not as hard as you think. There's really only 3 main controls on most cameras, and I'm gonna break those all down in this video in some depth so you guys can have an understanding of it. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about how you can start making adjustments with those settings to kind of achieve different looks in your images. If you've got your camera, go ahead and grab it. I'm a hands-on person, so for me it's helpful to be able to kind of move things around and finick with things as I'm watching videos. So if you've got it, great. If you don't, go ahead and just watch the video, and then next time you got your camera, you'll go check it out and try some of these things out. So let's get into it. The first of those 3 controls that I mentioned, the first one I would like to talk about is shutter speed. And essentially what shutter speed is inside of your camera, behind this lens, there is a sensor, which is what captures your images. So the shutter sits right in front of the sensor, and when you hit your shutter button and you take a picture, that shutter flap basically opens and closes, and the amount of time that the flap is open and the sensor is exposed to the light, that's known as your shutter speed. So if you have a really fast shutter speed where it's exposed for just a small fraction of a second, what's going to happen is it's going to really freeze the motion in your pictures, but what you're also going to notice is it's going to make that picture a lot darker. So if you're shooting in low light conditions, you might consider shooting at a bit of a slower shutter speed. And the problem there is, even though you're going to get a little bit more light into the sensor, what's going to happen is you're going to start to introduce a little bit of motion blur potentially if your shutter speed is too low. So I'm going to take a couple of example images for you guys here just to understand a little bit better what I'm talking about. So this first shot here I'm going to take at let's say 1/200th of a second. Okay, that looks pretty good, pretty well exposed. Now let's go ahead and bump our shutter up way high. Let's go to 1/1000th of a second. And we're gonna shoot the same exact shot. All the other settings are just the same. And you can see that image is a whole lot darker than the first one I took. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum just to see what happens. Let's take one at 1/20th of a second, which is quite a slow shutter speed in most cases. Yeah, so as you can see, again, we slowed the shutter speed down. We got a whole lot more light introduced into that image. But what happens if I take the camera at that same 1/20th of a second and I start to pan a little bit like this? I'm gonna do that. So as you can see in that image, what happened to the can is, because of the motion of my hands, we introduced a whole lot of motion blur to the subject in the image. So if you're shooting fast-moving subject, like say a car or a motorcycle going by, and you really want to freeze the motion of that, you're going to want to bump up your shutter speed nice and high to stop everything. I know there are times where you want that motion blur look. It can be a really cool effect, but for all intents and purposes, we're just gonna assume you want a nice crisp image. And so definitely start playing around with shutter speed and just experiment with it. Shoot cars going by, shoot animals, get your friend to run laps around you and just play around with those settings. And you'll start to understand a lot better kind of where those breaks are in properly exposing an image without introducing too much blur. So that's kind of a quick rundown of shutter speed. The next control on your camera I'd like to talk about is your aperture. So this is a big one stylistically. What your aperture does is essentially inside of your lens, you have these blades that kind of form a circle. And if you have a really low aperture number, so for example, this lens is a 1.8, which is a pretty fast lens. It's known as a pretty fast lens. What that means is you have a nice big open hole, essentially, where light can come in and hit that sensor. Now say I stop down my aperture to f16. What that's gonna do is it's gonna take those blades and it's gonna really constrict that hole, and you're just gonna have a really itty bitty hole that the light's coming in through and hitting your sensor. So kind of similar to what we talked about with shutter speed. A high aperture number like f16, f22, it's gonna allow a lot less light to come into the sensor. But what it does is those higher aperture numbers is it makes more of the image in focus. So I know for a lot of you guys maybe are portrait photographers. A lot of portrait photographers are gonna shoot at a really low aperture number like f1.8. Because what it does is you get your subject's face in focus, and then the background looks really nice and creamy and blurry, which is called bokeh. And that's achieved by shooting at a low aperture number, like f1.8, f1.2. Just really depends on the lens. A lot of kit lenses are only gonna go down to maybe f4 or f5.6. And that's okay. Again, this is something you just need to experiment with and kind of use the gear that you have. Don't rush out and buy a bunch of lenses, but just experiment with what you have and see how it changes things up. Now I've got the can set, staggered with another subject in the back. I'm gonna take that shot. And as you can see, the can and the thing behind it are relatively in focus at f5.6. Now, if I take that same shot, but I bump my aperture all the way down to f1.8, what you'll find is I'm focused on that can, but you can see the GoPro batteries in the back of that shot are totally out of focus. So the aperture affects that depth of field, as it's called in the industry. And so if you're going for that really blurry background look, a lower aperture number is going to really help out with that. But say you're shooting family portraits and everybody's kind of staggered a little bit, that's an instance where you're going to want to bump up that aperture number to make sure everything in the frame that you want in focus is in focus. Okay, so that's about it when it comes to aperture. Again, not super complicated. It's one of those things you really just got to go out and play around with. I find like shooting things in nature, trees, flowers, things like that are a good way to practice messing around with your aperture to see what's in focus in each image. Okay, and the third and final adjustment I wanted to talk about in today's video is called ISO. Essentially what ISO does is artificially it's introducing more light into your image or reducing the light in your image. On most cameras, native ISO is going to be 100, and if you're able to shoot at ISO 100 in most cases, that's usually a good thing. It results in a cleaner image, generally speaking. What you can do though is say you're shooting a basketball game and it's a really dimly lit situation and you still want to get those tack sharp images, so you have to bring your shutter speed up, but you're not getting enough light into the camera. So in that case, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to start increasing your ISO number. So I'm going to take a shot here of this can again at ISO 100. Okay, and as you can see, that shot's a little bit underexposed and the can is pretty darn dark. So what if I go ahead and I increase that ISO up to 800? Okay. Same settings otherwise, but I just increased my ISO, and that's a much better looking shot. We got better exposure on that can. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a different shot, but I'm going to increase my ISO really high to, let's say, 20,000, okay? Okay. And it may be hard to see on the YouTube video, but if you take a close look at this image, you're gonna find it's got a really grainy look to it, and the edges of the subject aren't quite as sharp. So that's the disadvantage with shooting at a really high ISO, is you're just gonna lose a bit of detail and you're gonna get that grainy look. So again, play around with this. This is going to be mostly for those early morning or nighttime or indoor types of scenarios where you're going to have to really rely on your ISO to get you proper exposure. All right, guys, so that's about it when it comes to the 3 main settings on your camera. Like I keep saying in this video, the best way to learn this stuff is just to grab your camera, go out, shoot something a million different ways, and see how those different settings affect it. You don't necessarily need a friend or anybody to help you with this. You can just go out and shoot cars going by, shoot squirrels, whatever, trees, anything really. If you got friends that do cool stuff, ride dirt bikes or something like that, that's even better. Go out and shoot a free session for them and learn about your camera. So I hope you guys found this really helpful. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments section, and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up, and if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next video. All right, peace out.